So Chris Ward from the Gregarious Memos will tell us the answer to the question that we frequently ask ourselves: Are we all doomed? So Chris, go ahead.
Okay. I gave this talk in Belgrade yesterday, and then was kept up most of the night by a benefit concert. So I've had about 2 hours sleep. And this is quite a heavy topic, and it's 3 o'clock on a Saturday. So I'm going to try and get through it as quickly as possible and as fun as possible. Basically, I spend kind of half my time as something of a tech journalist, going to lots of events around Europe, hearing people's ideas. And some of them are good, some of them are terrible, and some of them are slightly worrying. And I guess this is a talk that's a little bit about trying to summarize a lot of those conversations into looking at what we do and why. And yeah, trying to hopefully be positive. But let's start at the very, 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 very beginning, in that humans have always liked tools and technology. We've always made tools and technology to help us. So this, for example, are stone tools, weapons, hammers, various ways that we change the environment around us to help us to. And then this is obviously a modern picture, but it's an old concept, again using animals who obviously are not really technology, but we're utilizing them with some technology to, again, help us. And actually, farming like this was a massive, massive step forward. I suppose one of the interesting aspects of looking at aspects like this is realizing that technology that we think now is revolutionary and groundbreaking, there have been technologies comparable in the past, and we should always remember that. And actually, possibly a very good example of this is the printing press. A lot of people I speak to say, the internet is so amazing, it's enabling us to do X, Y, and Z. And I'm pretty sure that when the printing press came out, people were saying the same thing. And one of the most amazing things with the printing press is up until that point, being able to read and write was just a skill that the privileged had. And the printing press made the written word affordable and distributable. And that empowered a lot of people and educated a lot of people. So let's jump forward several centuries. I've already said that actually there's always been massive breakthroughs in technology, but I will also admit that, say, the past few decades, we have probably accelerated. And I would say maybe this is because the way that we can now communicate, we're all much so quicker connected. The pace is probably what has changed. So let's look at a few examples from the past sort of decade or so. So we had the smartphone. I am fully admitting that the iPhone was not the first smartphone, but of course it is one of the most famous and probably the one that sort of kick-started the revolution we now have. And the smartphone has helped us connect better, communicate better. It has empowered certain communities, especially in parts of Africa, that never had communication before. It's also empowered a lot of women in those parts of the world because they can do businesses distributing wealth amongst their communities that were not possible before. So it's had a lot of positives. Then we have social networks. Social networks have a lot of the similar things. Now the ability to keep in touch with people a lot easier and in many different ways from how we used to as well. Keep up to date with what's happening in our communities. And the interesting thing here is that communities used to be the people within a few hundred meters even, but at least a few kilometers of us. But now it could be along lines of interest instead of lines of just proximity. And kind of, this is, I guess, automated cars are not quite here yet. They work, but they're mostly not here yet because of regulation and infrastructure. But they will, and if you think to, for example, aeroplanes have been automated for some time, although in different ways, that they will again change a lot of society for the positive. There will probably be less accidents. Maybe we will need less cars. We will just call a car instead of owning our own car, thus reducing pollution and all sorts of aspects like that in our car-dominated cities. So we'll yet to see with that one. And then I guess finally here I'm using, this is HealthKit from Apple, but I'm using this as a demonstration of big data. Big data is behind a lot of these technologies now, and it's probably something a lot of you here are working with, processing it, recording it, analyzing it. But HealthKit is a good example in the US anyway. I'm not sure if it's actually available anywhere else, but of enabling medical professionals to do levels of research with numbers of people they were never able to do before. Most medical surveys in the past were limited to actually a few hundred people. And that had problems because often they were very misrepresented groups that didn't really give enough information about the population. And now with something like HealthKit, medical professionals can get information from tens of thousands of people within a month, which is actually quite amazing. But, so, is anyone familiar with this character? I'm never sure how universal this character is. This is one representation, anyway, of Frankenstein, or to be precise, Frankenstein's monster. It often gets a bit confused, but I'm just going to check my notes here because I want to get this exactly right. But the Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the main character is Dr. Victor Frankenstein, and he is a scientist, and he aims to prove his experiments in reanimating dead creatures by bringing back a human corpse. And then throughout the book, he's successful, obviously. Throughout the book, the monster turns on its creator, and Victor regrets his creation and the power it has over him. And in the English language, at least, I'm not sure if it's a universal catchphrase, the phrase Frankenstein's monster has come to sort of mean an invention you maybe regret, or an invention that you sort of wish you hadn't have created in the first place. And I think this is an important fact here, that as engineers, inventors, scientists, we often have a tendency to keep making things and keep creating things because it's a very natural human desire to do. And often we don't step back to question, why are we making something? And should we be making something? Are we doing it for a good reason or just to prove how clever we are? And this is something to think about. And Frankenstein is, of course, a work of fiction, but there are some real-life examples of this. There's Albert Einstein. He was partially involved in nuclear fission, and as an academic, as a scientist, as a mathematician, as a physicist, he believed in kind of the purity of his ideas, and they were somewhat spoiled by other people. And this is often what happens to engineers as well. We're idealists, and other people can ruin our idealism. Here's an interesting one. Mikhail Kalashnikov with his AK-47. Whoever would create a gun and think a gun wouldn't be used for bad, I'm not sure. But he regrets inventing the AK-47 because of the amount of people who used it and the sorts of people around the world who used it. I mean, it's a gun, but anyway. And to end on something a little lighter, you're probably now familiar with these coffee pods absolutely everywhere. John Sylvan, the inventor of these, also now regrets his invention because, of course, the waste from them is phenomenal. And he regrets ever having invented this. And history has many other examples of this. Sort of coming back to some of the things we just talked about and more recent examples, this article came up on The Guardian a couple of weeks ago, where a lot of the initial key engineers and developers behind algorithms on Google, Twitter, Facebook, a lot of these major platforms are now starting to regret their inventions. It's happening even to some of the inventions we just mentioned in the past 10 years. And having this opinion is becoming more widespread, but to have it from the creators is sort of more significant and is something that's worth thinking about quite a lot. But it's also very hard to have this opinion without being labeled as sort of a paranoid, paranoid I think is the only word that really describes it. But it's something to start thinking about. So let's look back at some of those devices from the past 10 years that we just looked at with a different lens. So the smartphone. There's a lot of positives for the smartphone, but there's a lot of negatives. They actually can increase isolation, or at least isolation from face-to-face communication. Then there's this aspect of fear of missing out. Now you know so much that's going on in the world around you, you always feel like you're missing out on something. I live in a big city, I live in Berlin, and there's always so many things going on that I know about, and you want to be in 10 places at once. And this actually has, it seems exciting, but it's a bit like a drug. There are similar chemicals that get triggered in your brain. It's quite addictive, and it's hard to get out of it. but you think it's good for you. There's a lot of sort of research happening now. Not everything's proved, but it's interesting to start at least having some concerns about this. Then there's definite effects on sleep. We have too many screens in front of us for too long. It's affecting our sleep, which affects stress, concentration, procrastination. So it's quite hard to focus now. But then also, let's think more pragmatically. For developers, mobile phones have really driven down the cost or the price that people are willing to pay for things. And that's a problem in itself as well. Let's have a look at social networks. Social networks kind of have a lot of the similar problems as smartphones, but also some other things. And I say this as possibly as a lot of you, as a child who was different and picked on at school and a bit lonely, and you never thought there's anyone like you, and then you had to go somewhere else to find there were people like you, and now with social networks you find people like you a lot quicker. There's positives there, but have they gone too far? Now maybe are we all living in our isolated worlds too much, and this is having some potential real-world knock-on effects. Things like filter bubbles and the increasing kind of extreme opinions that will not even try and have a discussion with each other anymore. And then bullying and trolling, the kind of troll face here. The internet has, or the networks especially, have led to the ability to be incredibly offensive to people for no real valid reason. And it's becoming a really big problem. And then we also have things like data harvesting, privacy, etc., etc., etc. When it comes to self-driving cars, this is the famous example from somewhere in Florida of a Tesla crash. It's actually been very few, but probably more because there's not that many of them yet. The interesting thing here to think about is, as developers, when an automated car crashes or is involved in an accident, what was to blame? And this is still yet to come to courts, but it will come to courts. And developers and technical teams and technical companies will become more and more responsible for things like this. Instead of the person behind the wheel, it could be one of us suddenly being responsible for causing an accident, which is something that we probably didn't think about when we started sort of working on some of these projects. And then finally, in kind of the big data world, this, if you're not quite sure what this is I was at a conference in Ukraine recently, and this was a talk from the CEO of Cambridge Analytica, the company that were responsible for the Trump campaign, the Brexit campaign, and a bunch of other things. And it was actually an incredible talk. Firstly, because he was so nice, and he was so nice and so casual about what they do. And it was hard not to like him, even though when he was telling you what they did, you sat there thinking, shit, you know. many strong words. And this is an example, as you can see, from the Iowa caucuses, and the ability of the quality of the data they had to really help the Trump campaign pinpoint almost individual people in streets that they should talk to and not waste their time on talking to people who were not interested in being spoken to. And another interesting aspect, they showed us an advertising platform they have where not only will the advert be targeted at you, that is pretty normal now, they actually change the content of the advert based on you as well, dynamically, which, I mean, it starts to get to some fairly crazy kind of things you can do. And he was such a nice guy, which is even more concerning, I think. So, of course, one of the obvious questions here is, well, as developers, we're just doing what we're told. And I don't want to get into some very dark territory here, because there's many examples from history of people saying they're just doing what they're told. But what I will say is, as developers, we are actually quite privileged. Even in poorer countries, we're quite privileged. If we are working for a company or for people whose ethics we don't believe in, we can go elsewhere. So if you have your own personal level of what you think is good or bad, then have the strength and the confidence to disagree and do something different, because there's plenty of other opportunities for you. So I guess one of the other big problems that is very obvious to talk about with the repercussions of some of these systems, and I'm now going to sort of focus a bit more into automated systems, artificial intelligence, mostly because it's a lot happening at the moment. But I think the key difference here is, as opposed to a lot of the other technological advancements of the past is we were still somewhat in control. We still had the ability to say, this was a dumb idea, let's stop doing this. But with a lot of automated systems now, the systems are starting to run themselves, and we're starting to lose control. So if there are potential problems, we need to think very carefully about them now, before it potentially becomes something we can't actually really slow down anymore. So, I mean, take, for example, the self-driving cars. This is going to have a very interesting impact on our societies. Not only are we talking about the actual drivers, and in certain countries, driving is a huge job, but also the industries that serve those people. Petrol stations, gas stations, service stations, little towns that are on major roads between two large places that rely on people needing food and things like that on the way. It's going to have a very big impact. And I think possibly as demonstrated in history is there will be a lot of short-term pain for maybe some long-term gain. But what those periods of time are is yet to be defined, of course. And it's not just people kind of working in factories and driving and things like that that are going to be affected. Here's an example of white-collar jobs that are already mostly automated, including, and here's an interesting one, actually, the medical profession is one of those areas where possibly has the biggest benefit by actually automating a lot of these, because humans make mistakes and machines make less mistakes, which we'll come to in a minute, but and actually helping humans with that sort of aspect could be something that's more positive. But yeah, and what about us? We like to think that, yes, okay, repetitive jobs that don't change very much, they're the ones that are most affected. We're creative people. We think, we solve big problems, we are flexible, we interpret knowledge. So we'll be okay, surely. Let's have a quick look. Here's this website that came out a few months ago about will I be replaced by a robot? Computer programmers, 48%. I mean, we also have to take all of this with a big sort of grain of salt, but a lot of programs are repetitive. So programming programs is not out of our near future, sorry. This is what I do for a job, technical writing. That's a lot more worrying for me. Although I think this more refers to some of the more repetitive stuff that's already automated from API specs and things like that. If I look at the more creative side of what I do, then a little bit happier. But actually, even that isn't completely safe. You probably can't read this, but here's an example of an article about wearable technology written by AIwriter.com. And this paragraph here I'll read to you. Increased reality and wearing technology could combine into a more realistic and engaging real-time environment. Okay, it's not great, but it's not terrible either. So even us, maybe we have to start thinking about what to do in the future. For the people running this event, things are even better. So I don't think machines will want to herd cats into conference rooms and book speakers anytime soon. You're still okay. And actually, if you're interested in reading some good articles around these topics, here's some I found. The Wikipedia page on historical technological unemployment is quite interesting. This is an interesting Guardian article quite recently. And this one I was reading on the plane today. It came out yesterday, I think. I can't remember what the date is, but it's very recent. And this is a really interesting article, actually. So what about some other areas? So here's a phrase that I'm going to claim for myself, so you can quote me if you like, is that algorithms are unbiased. This is one often statement that is made when we talk about automated systems. Algorithms are unbiased. They don't care, but we are. And at the moment, we are writing those algorithms. So there's been a lot of discussion in the tech community about certain demographics being well underrepresented in the tech community. And this has repercussions in many ways, but also has repercussions in the end product. It has some serious repercussions. And if we start thinking about these biases that we all bring as human beings, again, we still have that human handbrake to say, whoop, this isn't okay, let's stop this. But if we then introduce these biases to automated machines, then who knows what's going to happen. And there have been some recent examples of this. Here's a couple I'm going to go through, but there's plenty more. This is an example of Facebook. An Asian gentleman in New Zealand, I think someone told me, uploaded a passport photo, and it said it doesn't work because your eyes are closed. I mean, at the moment, we can sort of laugh about a lot of these things. But when we start thinking about it, it's actually quite ridiculous and quite serious. Here's one that's almost even worse, labeling people of a certain background as gorillas. I mean, we spent centuries getting over this stuff in history, and then for just to come up like that is something to think about. Here's another example. You don't have to hear the sound to see what happens here. You might have seen this on YouTube. Yep, black skin. I mean, why you would make a sensor that works on skin color, I don't know. And yeah, so, and I guess a lot of this comes from this aspect of, as a lot of technology being created by white men, we just bring a lot of our own biases, whether we think it's there or not. And even if we don't mean it, it's something we don't think about. And here's another very recent example. I think this was now the shortest lived feature ever. So on Google Maps in the US for about half a day, there was this feature that showed you how many cupcakes you could eat if you walked. And then within about an hour, mental health charities and eating disorder charities were talking to Google saying, what the hell? We've got to take this down. And again, it's just one of those aspects of not having a sort of mixture of people to think about some of the ideas here. And I already alluded to the fact that the reason we have to start worrying about this now is AIs are already programming AIs. So if they have our biases, this is a big problem. So, kind of wrapping up. I'm not a Luddite, and if you read some of the Wikipedia pages I mentioned, your Luddite may not be as familiar to non-English speakers, but basically people who kind of, in the Industrial Revolution, attacked technology or anti-technology. I love technology, actually. I've been working with technology all my life. I love it, and I'm pro-change and pro-improving our lives, and I think this is the important aspect. We should be improving our lives and enhancing our lives, not replacing ourselves. So don't stop creating, but when you do start creating, let's start asking a couple of questions first. So, oops. Oh, spoiled the surprise there. The first one is, just because you can, should you? And this applies to a lot of the big controversial projects we've talked about, but it also applies at a very small level. How many GitHub graveyards are there out there of projects that people created for no real reason instead of collaborating with someone else? So even at a micro level, let's think about working with other people instead of just creating new things all the time. Then secondly, it would be think of the consequences first. There's a good rule of thumb, I can't remember who told me this, but always try to think of the most ridiculous worst case scenario and go back from there. And the chances are that'll never happen, but at least it gets you thinking kind of extremely about what could happen with what you're making. So some of the final points. I think this is the most important one. As we move into this sort of new world of automated systems, let's try to enhance humans and not replace them. This is how good technology has worked in the past. Let's remember the users, and I mean this not just from a user experience perspective, but the various hundreds of thousands of different types of people there are in the world, which means involving people from different backgrounds. And in some countries, this is harder than in others. But there are ways to get the feedback from diverse populations on the internet. And finally, for our own peace of mind and not to be replaced ourselves, keep learning and stay up to date. So sort of coming back to the phrase of the conference, the future is up to us, the future is up to you. So try to be awesome with it and do good and not bad. So thank you very much. And this is where you can find me.